Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant to bring you part 3 of my Zerg vs Tyranids matchup. This section will cover the offensive capabilities of each side. For starters, though, I owe you all an apology. In my previous section regarding the speed capabilities of each side, I managed to somehow totally miss the fact that the Zerg are in fact a spacefaring species. They have giant ships from which they deploy forces, including the Leviathan, which are about 11 kilometers long, and can carry tens of thousands of Zerg, including all the evolution chambers and such necessary for adapting the capabilities of the Zerg to face new threats. In addition, all the flying Zerg units have ways of traveling through space using various means, including the winged mutalisks, which use what amount to basically musk glands that expel gas and scoot their way through space that way. The nuances aren't particularly important. The main thing is, the Zerg do in fact have whole fleets of spacefaring organic ships, and they warp around with those vessels from planet to planet. As mentioned in the previous section, the warp field they generate is so powerful they can actually pull Zerg directly off the face of a planet, so their mobility is still super amazing, particularly when compared to the relatively sluggish Tyranid faster-than-light travel. I'd also like to take this opportunity to establish one ground rule I didn't mention before. I will not be anticipating every bit of evolutionary arms race that each side will perform. Both sides are quite capable of not only performing intelligently forced evolution on themselves to counter specific threats, but also of getting a hold of the genetic information of useful species they encounter and integrating the useful bits that they find into their own genes. The reason I'm not going to go into this element too much beyond mentioning it is because both sides would basically end up constantly stealing from one another, and really all that would end up happening is that whatever faction started having an advantage would start to snowball really hard as that advantage got more and more extreme because the other side would have less and less opportunity to actually implement their own adaptations. Alright, on to the weaponry. Fortunately for this section, both sides have mostly pretty straightforward weaponry. They use sharp claws, acid, and smaller members of their own species as weapons. Where they differ is in terms of how much damage those weapons can actually inflict, and really the best way to judge this is by looking at what kind of defenses they're actually typically trying to defeat in their respective universes. So, I'll be looking at the effectiveness of Zerg weapons against the Terran Marines and Tyranid weapons against Imperium Space Marines. I'll be looking at the Space Marines because your typical Imperium Guardsmen may as well be armored in cardboard considering the weaponry being thrown around at the time, so yeah, the Space Marines are a much better rubric. Before I dive into how much damage needs to be done for them to be effective in their respective universes, though, I'd like to touch on that last category of weaponry, the shooting smaller members of your species at your enemy's bit. Starting with the Zerg, there's really 3 kinds of weaponized units that use themselves as ammunition: Banelings, Broodlings, and Locust. Banelings are basically walking mines. They can burrow to remain hidden and then surface and charge at enemies before exploding, hopefully taking some of the enemy with them. Locusts are a little different. They're sort of a weird symbiote with swarm host units from which they're born and from which they launch and then attack targets with volleys of acidic saliva. Finally, Broodlings are basically the ammo of Zerg Queens and Broodlords. They get launched at ground targets from the air and are essentially meth head mini Zerglings, which just attack until their little bodies give out, just shredding through personnel and armor alike. With the Tyranids, it's important to constantly remind yourself of one thing. Everything the Tyranids use is Tyranid. They don't build ships, they have giant Tyranids that fly around space and carry other Tyranids, or at least the biomass to make more. They don't have bullets, they have tiny Tyranids, which they launch at enemies, and then, they do their own thing. Included among their definitely not bullets are barbed strangler weapons, which fire seeds that then grow to maturity in seconds, spreading out barbed tendrils in all directions. It's like a hollow point from hell. Death spitters, which basically fire maggots, except those maggots have corrosive innards, so they peel the shell off and launch it really quick at the enemy, just splattering them with acid that dissolves them. And then there's devourers, which fire flesh worms at their enemies, which then begin eating whatever they hit, working their way through the nervous system to the brain. It's very wonderfully gruesome. There's more, but you get the idea. With the Tyranids, it's all about cutting stuff, eating stuff, dissolving stuff in acid, or chucking around smaller Tyranids, which then do the cutting, eating, and dissolving for them. Alright, so how destructive are these weapons? As I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to say for sure, but we can get something of an idea by comparing what they're going up against. Terran Marines for Zerg, and Space Marines for Tyranids. I should point out right away that while a single Zergling can take out a Terran Marine if they manage to get close enough without being shot to death first, but a single Hormigaunt would need to get pretty lucky to take down a Space Marine by itself, even if it managed to survive closing the gap between them. Space Marines are just really scary. That said, specific information on composition and thickness of armor worn by the two kinds of Marines is unavailable, but we do get some very generalized information, so we'll do what we can. Terran Marines have a lot of varieties of armor, but only one that actually has listed what the armor is made of, which is the CMC-400A armor, which has an outer shell made of 80% depleted uranium and 20% titanium. Apparently, concerns over giving Marines radiation poisoning are secondary to keeping them from getting shot to pieces too easily. In any case, since this is the only armor that gave me any kind of specifics on the materials, that's what I'll be assuming they all use. This armor is noted to be impervious to all small arms fire, with the exception of needle guns, which are basically mini railguns. They're Gauss rifles. Zerglings 1v1 versus Terran Marines are capable of killing the Marine, so their claws must do enough damage to penetrate depleted uranium, which is pretty dang impressive. Alternatively, it's possible that they go for relatively lightly armored joints and such, but for the sake of argument, let's just go with them shredding right through the armor, which is very, very impressive. For the uninitiated, depleted uranium is what you make your bullets out of so that they will go through other armor. It's very, very hard stuff. Imperium Space Marines also use a variety of armor types, but the materials that they're using include adamantium, plasteel plates, and ceramite ablative layer to help repel energy attacks. Plasteel is basically just as tough as steel. It's just, more plastic, so it's easier to work with. It's future steel. So there's not much special there, and ceramite isn't really meant to repel melee attacks. It's meant to distribute and absorb energy attacks. Adamantium, on the other hand, is the toughest material known to the Imperium, and it is impervious to attacks from most kinds of weapons. It's adamantium. It's meant to be basically indestructible. Tyranids can pierce that armor. Their acid can melt through that armor. Their smaller ammo varieties of Tyranids can get through this armor and eat the Marine inside. I will add the caveat that unless it's some piece of artifact armor that is thousands of years old and has been discovered or whatever, the armor won't be made entirely of adamantium, but there's your benchmark. I'll not dive into too much detail on the levels of destruction caused by each side's acid. It melts armor and enemies. That's what it does. The tiny weaponized Zerg and Tyranids, they're super dangerous. How dangerous they are is not that important. The main thing is the blades that are used by each side are capable of getting through their respective armors, and it's fairly clear to me at least that Tyranids need to defeat much more formidable armor, so I think it's fair to assume that Tyranids have somewhat more destructive weaponry overall. You also need to consider that the larger units on each side are capable of inflicting more damage than their smaller counterparts, just by force of strength at the very least, which again doesn't actually do the Zerg any favors because the largest Tyranid units are about twice the size of the largest Zerg units. So in terms of overall scaling, the Tyranids also get the biggest units. As for space combat, the same weaponry really still applies. Tyranid ships in particular are demonstrated as being able to chase down and basically eat entire ships that they're fighting, so both sides do plenty of chucking around acid and such to defeat their enemies, and there's no reason to think that their weapons wouldn't be effective upon each other. I will point out, though, that the largest Zerg ships, the Leviathans, are about 11 kilometers long, whereas the Tyranid hive ships are between 16 and 24 kilometers long, so again, about twice as big. That said, in a given Tyranid fleet, you'll have one, maybe a couple hive ships, but you'll find hundreds of escort ships, including Devourers, Razor Fiends, and such, none of which are anywhere near the size of either a Leviathan or hive ship, but all of which are much bigger than Mutalisks or Corruptors, which are the rest of what the Zerg use in space. So overall scaling, the Tyranids are still bigger in space. And again, all the weaponry is still effective, it's just the Tyranids are going to have more of it. And with that, I'll wrap this up. In the next section, I'll be going into the defensive capabilities of each side, but until then, what do you all think? Did I make a mistake like last time and totally miss a huge part of lore that I really need to correct in my next video? If so, please let me know in the comments. I try to be as accurate as I can with these, and that was just plain sloppy. Sorry. But until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.